A Wrinkle in History, The Philosopher's Desire, The Theater of Truth, In Defense of Religious Moderation, The Man Who Invented Fiction, The Splintering of the American Mind, and most recently, The Rigor of Angels, which was named to several best of 2023 lists, including the New York Times and the New Yorker. He's the co-author with David Castillo of Mediologies, Reading Reality in the Age of Inflationary Media, and What Would Cervantes Do? Navigating Post-Truth with Spanish Baroque Literature. His latest book on the philosophical, psychoanalytic, and surrealist dimensions of the work of Chilean director Alejandro Jodorowsky was published in January 2024. As you can see, Bill is a slacker of the first order. I'm kidding, of course. Bill is one of those scholars and teachers and friends who inspires by what he does and how he does it, but who also always has time for others. And in this sense, I put him alongside our own Linda Hutchin as a model academic and person in this field. A friend to the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, Victoria College, and the Northrop Frye Center. He's our first distinguished lecturer to be invited back as we celebrate now more than a decade as a renewed site for humanities inquiry here at U of T. And in the spirit of convivial exchange, I can think of no better person to inaugurate our next phase. Please join me in welcoming Bill Egginton.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, all of you, for this gracious invitation to return to the Northrop Frye Center, to the University of Toronto. It's at this point really a home away from home for me. It's fantastic to be back whenever I can be. Let's see, make sure that I've got the right one here. Okay, early modern artificial intelligence. Right now, neither of these is working. Let's see. That's early modern artificial intelligence for you. Trying to exemplify it. Try this now. Maybe this one, because there's two now. Okay, now go back. There we go. Thank you very much. That's my own early modern artificial ignorance showing itself here. So let's get started. When we talk about AI today, we have to immediately keep in mind a series of promises that have been made and promises that we see being fulfilled. We see a tool that can aid us in medicine and science. We see space exploration being made possible in ways perhaps that it never could have been before with this extraordinarily powerful tool. Do we have a volume? Okay, good. Obviously, it's been and will continue to be an enormous driver of economic innovation. There's any number of different ways that we could think about how AI can use its massive potential to better society. In general, performing tasks that humans don't want to do or can't do in some cases. And also, we've seen them entering the realm of the intimate in certain ways, providing companionship, advice, even therapy. Threats, of course. We have no end to our ability to imagine the threats that AI can come up with. Entrenching human error and bias isn't just a threat, it's real. It's happening all the time, as we've had plenty of reports about. Enabling repressive regimes through technologies like facial recognition being used to impose new levels of surveillance on populations. Diminishing our human capacities through the overuse of certain technologies. I think immediately of my children and the inability they have to find their way from point A to point B without Google Maps, and how scary that is for me. Exacerbating the devastation of war, potentially. There's actually a big debate that's going on in the area of thinking about warfare. Autonomous weapon systems, are they in fact worse, or is there a potential for them to make war somehow more surgical, more exact, with fewer casualties? Then, of course, there's becoming actually autonomous and taking over the world, hence the images that we have of the movies that are so imprinted on our collective imagination now, from the Terminator to, of course, the Matrix, which you'll see on the right here as well. The point that I want to make is that in this list of pretty obvious tools that can either go bad or tools that can help us in a positive way, those last items have something a little bit different. whether it's providing companionship, something that you have as an actual interlocutor on the one hand, or becoming, as I said, actually autonomous and taking over the world. Both of these imply something else, something different than merely being a tool. So in the talk today, we're going to follow the following structure. First, we're going to talk about what that missing thing might be, or what that element is that seems to set those last items on the list at a different level. And this is the question of agency. What would it mean for something not human to develop something like agency? And for that, we'd have to interrogate, in fact, what we mean when we talk about agency. There's going to be three approaches then that I'm going to follow through. One I'm going to call the perfect language approach. And this is where a lot of the early modern artificial intelligence is going to come in. In fact, we're going to start in the Middle Ages, but then spend a little bit more time in early modern Europe. Then we get a little bit more into my particular approach to this, which I call the theatricality approach. And I'll explain why as we get to that point. And then finally, what I'm calling the internal limit approach, which evolves out of the question of theatricality. All right, good. Let's begin with agency. What it is, what does it mean for us when we talk about something being an agent? Well, on the one hand, we have in the past thought about creatures that react to the world in a way that doesn't imply agency. And one of the terms that's been used to discuss that or to think about that is instinct. If you're an organism that reacts in a stimulus response fashion to the rest of the world, one has theoretically made a distinction between those creatures, organisms that can make decisions about the world, and those, or at least think that they're making decisions, and we're going to talk about that distinction as well, and those that are simply reactive, kind of following through in a life flow pattern of stimulus and response. On the other hand, there's the distinction that was implicit in those lists. Something can be a tool, perhaps even you or I could be a tool. When we behave in a way where we're not a tool, when we're not being used as the means for something else, we're, in theory, then exhibiting agency. So Aristotle had a theory of what he called in Greek psyche, what was then translated as anima in the Middle Ages, and what we can roughly refer to as the soul. But for Aristotle, and we're going to go into this in a little bit of detail right now, the soul, the psyche, was something that in fact animated things. It's a source of what we refer to as life. And so what that enabled Aristotle to do was to distinguish between various kinds of life. And he had a rough classification system that broke down into those things which are alive but not animate, which are called vegetal states. Then sensitive creatures, those which are in fact reacting to their environment, moving, pursuing, but always in a stimulus response kind of chain. And then finally, the highest version for Aristotle of the soul was what he called the rational soul. And that's precisely where Aristotle would attribute something like rationality, not just rationality, but agency, a decision-making capacity on the part of a living creature. This theory in the early modern period received a complete working over on the part of Descartes. He also used the term soul, and he thought about souls, but he drew that distinguishing line in a very different place. For Descartes, the line between what had a soul and what didn't have a soul, if you will, moved closer to the human, and it was really lined up with the idea of rationality. Rationality and agency belonged to humans in particular. That meant that there was a whole class of beings that were animate, but didn't exhibit the same interior life, didn't exhibit the same kind of decision-making capacity. And these he referred to in a general sense as automata. So automata were not only things that started to be built and considered and thought about in the early modern period, it became a whole philosophical class of organisms that seem to react in the world as if they had something like agency, but don't. And this is an important distinction that Descartes brings into the question. So sticking for the moment with early modern, but now literature, we can find examples of both theories, if you will, an Aristotelian, a Greek theory of what comes and brings an animate force into something, into an organism, and something else that we'll call maybe a subjective force or an agency force. So let's take this famous and really awful moment in Othello, where Othello is contemplating the crime that he's about to commit. And he starts saying, It is the cause, my soul. Let me not name it to you, you chase stars. It is the cause, yet I'll not shed her blood, nor scar that whiter skin of hers than snow, and smooth as monumental alabaster. Yet she must die, else she betray more men. Put out the light, and then put out the light. If I quench thee, thou flaming minister, he says, speaking to the lamp, if I quench thee, thou flaming minister, I can again thy former light restore. Should I repent me? But once put out thy light, thou cunningst pattern of excellent nature, I know not where is that Promethean heart that can thy light relume. When I have plucked the rose, I cannot give it vital growth again. So here in this moment on the verge of committing his crime, Othello is contemplating what it is that gives Desdemona something that would be irreplaceable, that could not be relit, relumed once extinguished. So as I said, we could think about two vectors in some ways meeting in the early modern period. An animation vector that we see coming from the Greeks, from Phaedo, and from Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, from Aristotle. This is the translation then later by St. Thomas Aquinas, De Anima, or from characters like we have in Othello. So in Phaedo, Plato's dialogue goes like this: tell me then, what is that of which the inherence will render the body alive? The soul, he replied. And is this always the case? Yes, he said, of course. Then whatever the soul possesses, to that she comes bearing life? Yes, certainly. Or in a simple form in Aristotle, what has soul in it differs from what has not, in that the former displays life. Complete alignment between a life force and this idea of that which animates soul. Iago, in this play, betrays a different understanding. And it's these two that I want to bring together today. Iago, good Lord, good my Lord, pardon me. Though I am bound to every act of duty, I am not bound to that all slaves are free to utter my thoughts. So Iago's argument, as I say here, is that he cannot be bound at that point where even slaves are free. That is, the freedom of their own thoughts, this distinction between the inside and the outside. He is not forced, nor is anyone with agency forced to wear their inner thoughts upon their sleeves. In other words, Iago posits his essence, his being. It's somehow you're not seeing it right there, but where he posits his essence or his being is precisely in his ability to not be what he seems to be, right? Drawing a distinction between his external self and his internal self. All right, an important stipulation. When we're talking about agency, we're talking about making free choices as opposed to following instructions in some way. It also entails experiencing the world as opposed to merely appearing to experience the world. And so what I'm going to try and show you throughout this talk is that the two are actually exactly the same. That the idea of actually experiencing the world as opposed to simply appearing to experience the world is in fact identical with exhibiting some kind of an attribute that we would call agency. I'd like to get us into that mode of thought by thinking about the British sci-fi series Black Mirror, and one particular wonderful episode, and many of you may have seen it, in which a chip is available that you can put into your brain and relive past experiences absolutely perfectly. Or in fact, you can take someone else's experience and live them. And so I want us to think a little bit about that. What would it entail? What would it mean to relive an experience from the past with absolute perfect, all five senses, technicolor, smell, scent, everything like that, but to really, really relive it? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is the following paradox. If you're truly reliving it, I mean, really, in every possible sense, you're no longer reliving it. You're actually living it for the first time, in which case there's no sense of a memory of the past. It's just, imagine a little snippet of videotape or of DVD, something that you simply replay. For you to watch it again, you're remembering something. It jogs a memory. It recalls a moment in the past. But what if you were identical to the snippet of tape? If you were identical to what's being replayed? Then You could replay it 1 time, 2 times, or 1,000,000 times. You're not going to know the difference. It's the same because it's the first time for you. As Borges once said, you'd have to have a special angel sitting on your shoulder that manages to escape all of those repetitions in order to be able to register that it was a repetition in the first place, right? That little something extra. Now is the next step. If you can follow me in that argument about a memory, you should quickly see that the exact same thing takes place with anything that we would call a perception. Just as a memory requires something like a modicum of difference from what's being remembered to be perceived, to be experienced, a perception of the world, an immersion in the sensory world also requires something that synthesizes moments over time, something that installs a modicum of difference that allows there to be a self that's in fact experiencing these moments over time. Okay. And this is just what is just such a self that is the condition of possibility for considering different paths and choosing one. And that is where agency comes in. And that's why agency is in fact entailed by experience. The ability to choose, which is the same as the ability to wish one had chosen differently, involves not being so completely immersed in a sensory experience that one is not able, for example, to remember that it's different from the past or to experience it as something that could be happening differently. So now getting into the current philosophy and sort of headlines ripped from at least X, or what was called Twitter, I think at the time. 2 thought experiments courtesy of the linguist Emily Binder. Let's start with actually the one on the right. That was a reaction on the part of Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, to a thought experiment that Emily Binder had put out there. And the thought experiment was, well, it's not really a thought experiment. It was a designation of the kind of thinking, if it's indeed thinking, that large language models are up to. She called them stochastic parrots. Stochastic parrots because they're parroting words that existed before, and they're doing so on the basis of algorithms that conclude, based on the numbers they're running, what is the most likely to be acceptable following word to fall into a pattern, a sentence. Altman's reaction was a very interesting one. It wasn't to say, no, what we're doing here at OpenAI is not being a stochastic parrot. It was in some ways to accept the criticism and then throw the challenge back. You think you're any better? You humans? I'm a stochastic parrot, and so are you, he responded. Emily Binder's experiment came hand in hand with another one that she'd been shopping around for a while. It's a little bit more extravagant, but it involves trying to imagine you and someone else. She just calls them in the original article, A and B, as being on 2 deserted islands with only one way of communicating between them. And that is by passing kind of sign language messages across the space of the water via an octopus, very skilled octopus, right? The idea here is that should something happen, however, that is outside of the octopus's realm of possible experience, for example, a bear is attacking A, and A wants to get the message across to B, a bear is attacking me, and I could really use some sticks to come to my defense. The octopus, with no experience of either bear or stick, can still translate ideas and signs across, but could not possibly have any idea what these signs mean, by which Emily Binder means have experience that is being recalled by this use of signs. This was not a new thought experiment. That's going to be one of the points that I'm making in our lecture today. There's a long history of thinking about this problem. And one way we can phrase it is this. To what extent is what we call experience actually reducible to information? To what extent can our experience of the world be encoded, lifted out of the world, passed on to someone else, and then reiterated? I'm going to tell you that and try to show you that this is not a technology-dependent question. This is a question that existed in the philosophical sphere long before the very possibility of creating machines like the ones that we have today that are capable of producing large language models and actually engaging us the way they do today, in fact, ever existed. So I call this talk Early Modern Artificial Intelligence. I'm going to start with someone in the Middle Ages and paint a very rapid genealogy of thinkers grappling with the idea that's going to come clear in a few minutes about how information might be capable of encoding the entirety of existence, and even doing so in a way that would lose the arbitrary nature of the way that we learn languages in the world. The first approach to this comes from this scholar in the early 13th into the late 13th and early 14th century, Ramon Llull. Absolutely fascinating. He actually had this extraordinary idea that you could encode the knowledge of the world in such a way and build up a progression from the specific experience of lived life that might be different for you and me, every single one of those of us, but build them up to a level of generality where we would all be capable of thinking the exact same thing without a hitch between. If you had a perfectly rational system of expressing the world, of turning it into language, you could then use that perfectly rational system in order to convince those who, by the way, have fallen into error and believe the wrong things about God, for example, of the error of their ways, convince them of the true way. So I'm going to show you both of these quotes from a wonderful book by Noel Blanco Murray. The Ars Magna is a logic machine, he writes, designed to generate a system of notation capable of demonstrating the incontrovertibility of the Christian faith to Jewish and Muslim wise men throughout the Mediterranean. Ramon Llull and his disciples sought to disseminate this art of conversion by perfecting the technology of the book, incorporating, and this is true and it's remarkable, we have some copies as well as at our Hopkins library in Hopkins, incorporating a series of geometrical figures and movable circles to teach preachers and academics a new intellectual language. You could actually move the dials in these books, in these manuscripts by Llull, in order to find a way of translating, a mechanism, if you will, of translating the specificity of experience all the way up the ladder of being to the most general and ultimate truths. So, according again to Blanco Murray, Llull was widely considered the first thinker to attempt a purely logical project of constructing a perfectly logical language. The idea, of course, was to lead monotheists to a truth, a fundamental truth about God and creation. He used, and this is Steiner now, who also wrote about him, symbolic notation and combinatory diagrams to classify and interrelate all intellectual disciplines. And this very project was later adopted by a number of thinkers in the early modern period to greater or lesser extent. And we're going to take a look at a few of these and end up spending a little bit more time with Leibniz. So first we have Urquhart's book from the mid-17th century, which aimed to appropriate, and I chose this quote simply because it was so pithy in terms of exactly what these projects were aiming at. Appropriate the words of the universal language with the things of the universe. That was conceived of or seen as a potential weakness in knowledge. The fact that different peoples in different places spoke differently about the world was also a clue, came down to us from the Tower of Babel, that humanity had fragmented and in many cases lost the way back to the single truth. This was then a project that would involve reconstructing these languages and finding the perfect logical one that could get us back to that lost original truth. John Wilkins, fascinating book, later parodied beautifully, extraordinarily by Borges himself. His essay Towards a Real Character in a Philosophical Language from 1668 sought to use symbolic notations to create a language connecting the most general to the most particular. And what's beautiful about these charts that Wilkins puts forward is you can actually see the attempt to create that lattice work, a ladder that goes from the most general to the most particular and back, and does so in a way that, according to Wilkins, could be completely universal and absolutely without any trace of arbitrary origin. Now, this is just jumping up to the present a little bit, but I want you to think, because when I look at some of these extraordinary charts that he puts in his book, this is what comes to my mind. Neural networks. Long before the actual technology of creating neural networks the very same neural networks that in fact power large language models, someone like Wilkins was thinking the logical structure of how such a neural network would have to work. There's an input side, there's something happening to that input, and then there's an output side, and the output has to be a generalization that brings together all of the possible specificities, that recognizes difference, synthesizes over it, and comes up with some kind of a communicable answer in the end. Let's get to Leibniz now. So Leibniz, of course, is known very justifiably for having been one of the great creators of calculus, to the great benefit of humankind and to the great chagrin of my 16-year-old son who's now having to study the darn stuff. I try to explain to him the importance. In fact, I don't need to go very far in explaining it to him. It's obvious. He's also taking physics. He understands that what calculus allows you to do, which wasn't possible before Newton and Leibniz, is to have something along the lines of algorithms plumb the depths of irregular spaces. So spaces prior to this extraordinary mathematical tool could be in some ways measured, but always very abstractly, because you would have to do so with regular lines, and the universe isn't carved into regular lines. What Leibniz and Newton managed to do was to use the differential calculus to plumb the depths of the irregular, which in some ways, and this is what I want us to think about right now, is a very similar project to using something like an early modern neural network to try and bridge the absolutely particular with the absolutely general. It's trying to make laws out of that which in some ways doesn't conform naturally to the laws, right? The roughness of reality somehow needs to be turned into patterns that can be manipulated and moved. And that's what he said about it at the end. He's also at the same time thinking about, how do I produce a machine that can think the world the way that my calculus can with spaces, right? With curved spaces, a machine that can process the irregularity of the world and do so with the kind of efficiency that calculus can. But he also had this extraordinary thought experiment. And I told you there was going to be a background, a deep background to Emily Binder's thought experiment, right? It's come in many different forms, but one of my favorite ones is Leibniz's. In Leibniz's thought experiment, he says, imagine a mill that's so complicated that it can actually replicate what humans do when they walk around in the world. They're receiving impulses from the outside. Well, a mill does that too. You put matter into it. It's got machinery. It has an output that comes out at the other end. He says, however, there's no way, if that, no matter how big and complicated that mill is, if we go into that mill and look around in it, we're not going to find the source of something like experience, the source of something like agency in that mill in any one place. It has to be produced by the mill as a whole. And yet, Leibniz said there's no way that this can be done mechanically in the end. Of course, Leibniz was a deist. He did believe that the world could actually be conveyed in information, but that information ultimately was not only stemming from or coming from God, it was in some ways identical to the mind of God. So I said we were going to have some machines in this as well. This is a particularly beautiful automaton from the 18th century now by Jacques Ethos. What's important about the machinery in the back that I wanted to show is the clockwork technology that had been developed at the time was so fine. These are called stacks of what are called cams, carved out of bronze, that by replacing and ordering the stacking of these cams and then allowing the clockwork to turn, the little boy with enough ink in his pen was able to actually produce sentences as programmed, right, by the clockmaker. And of course, there's many examples of this. We were talking earlier about the examples of musical automaton that can play beautiful tunes back very, very precisely. So this was a fascination at the time, a fascination that really followed on the heels of thinking about the world in terms of that which has or evinces experience in some way, and those creatures that seem to but don't, and what could possibly be the difference. David Hume, philosophically, have been fascinated with this project. He says in the Inquiry on Human Nature the following, more or less: and I'm paraphrasing it. I dive down into every experience that I can think of. I explore it, I tear it apart. And in every time that I do so, I never come up with a self who's doing the experiencing. I only find the experience itself, the raw, pure impressions of the world. Who is this self that's experiencing something, David Hume said. And he was kind of a morose, depressive Scot. And so he found this almost reasons to get rid of himself, but he managed to survive. Rodney Brooks, to jump forward in time to the late 20th century and in early 21st century, Rodney Brooks at MIT has been running a laboratory whose purpose is to recreate the actual experience of humans, but doing so sort of from the ground up, not trained from the top down, but actually creating robots that learn how to become sensory, that pile up their intuitions of the world, so to speak, from experimenting and from failing, bumble around. Rodney Brooks, from his perspective, says, consciousness is not something that's given to us. It's not added to the machine in some way, as Leibniz would suggest. It's a cheap trick. So there he's, in fact, say parroting, but it's not parroting because Altman said it later. It's very much in line with Altman's point of sort of pushing back on us. Who are you humans to think that you've got something different than a complicated machine, than a cheap trick of one of the robots in Rodney Brooks's lab? As Megan O'Giblin writes in a really terrific book, Brooks, like Turing, and we're going to talk about Turing very soon, was trying not to build machines with minds or souls, but rather to prove that nothing of the sort was needed for a machine to behave in a way that was convincingly human. Again, the challenge, the gauntlet is dropped. What is it that we think we have that machines potentially don't have? So that's what we're going to get into now. Let's go right into that famous test, the Turing test. So the basic idea is this: first-person experience of the world is the only true test of thinking. We can't get around that, according to Turing. 1950 essay, and he basically says, that's it. Once we have decided that we can't be convinced otherwise, that the thing that we're talking to, the machine that we're engaging with, is in fact human, then that's all it takes. There's no other measure for it. Then he says very famously, the original question, can machines think, I believe to be too meaningless to deserve attention. So the very article that was set out to talk about whether it's plausible to make a machine that thinks ends up saying it's a meaningless question. And I think we have to take this very, very seriously. We think about it, and this is, I think, what Altman is doing in that tweet, is a way of ultimately leveling the difference between complex machines and anything else. It's just our own hubris that would suggest there's anything else going on. Comic John Mulaney has a different way of thinking about it. The world is run by robots, he says. And we spend most of our day telling them we're not robots. What is he reacting to? Of course, the invention of the man on the right, of Luis von Ahn, who, in addition to being the brains behind Duolingo, created CAPTCHA. How many people knew that? Did everyone know that he created CAPTCHAs? Yeah. He says himself, I know, I completely agree. Extremely annoying things, right? CAPTCHAs. You know, the CAPTCHAs where you're constantly being tested by the computer, whether you're not a computer or not. But what I also didn't know until recently is what CAPTCHAs stood for. And in fact, that's what they are: completely automated Turing tests to tell computers and humans apart. So in fact, John Mulaney is right. We do spend our time not only being asked by computers to distinguish ourselves from computers, but also giving, by way of doing that, the computers the evidence and the training that they need to do it better and better and better themselves, right? They're training themselves on our answers to the CAPTCHAs. What the Turing test is fundamentally about is what philosophers call epistemic privilege. And so I want to do a little bit of a historical literary genealogy of where this particular model or idea of epistemic privilege comes from. And I can't think of a better place to go than at the origins of modern literature, the origins of the modern novel, in Don Quixote, where we have many extraordinary scenes like this, but this one particularly funny, where Don Quixote and Sancho are in fact arguing about this object that they can't seem to decide what it actually is, even though they have the same object in front of them. Well, Sancho, by the same oath you swore before, I swear to you, said Don Quixote, that you have the dimmest wits that any squire in the world has or ever had. It is possible, or is it possible, that in all the time you've traveled with me, you have not yet noticed that all things having to do with knights errant appear to be chimerical, foolish, senseless, and turned inside out, and not because they really are, but because hordes of enchanters always walk among us and alter and change everything and turn things into whatever they please, according to whether they wish to favor us or destroy us. And so what seems to you to be a barber's basin seems to me to be the helmet of Mambrino, and will seem another thing to someone else. This extraordinary moment, I take it as an instantiation of this problem that this novel is really all about, which is, how really do you know that the reality that you're inhabiting is the same for other people, right? When you can't, in fact, inhabit their skins, when you can't see the world, they can. So not many decades after that book was published and then translated into French, Descartes was writing his Meditations. And I can even imagine the scene that he paints for us at the beginning of that book. I can imagine him glancing up, looking for an example from literature and thinking, in fact, of, oh, that book that I read, it's up there, right? Don Quixote. Why do I think that? I've made this argument before. And Stephen Nadler, I'm going to show in a moment as well, the philosopher at Wisconsin, has made this point that there really seems to be an extraordinary resonance between the very words that Descartes used when he came up with this ultimate thought experiment that he said, génie malin, right? Who the malign genie, the evil genius, the evil force, who's going to turn the world and everything that I see in it into something else for me. But that but remains, because that whatever is left over from that is in fact what he ends up creating or positing as the very source of all apodictic knowledge. The distinction between what I can't know about, I can't know if it's true, and what I absolutely can, which is that something appears to me. So, as I said, both Nadler, myself, believe that there's something very specifically coming from Don Quixote when he writes this, but he writes the following. Now, as far as ideas are concerned, if they are considered alone and in their own right, without being referred to something else, they cannot, properly speaking, be false. For whether it is a she-goat or a chimera, and I ask you to remember the line that was used, in fact, in Edith Grossman's translation, that I'm imagining, it is no less true that I imagine the one than the other. If you go back to the original in Spanish, Cervantes actually uses the creature itself. He doesn't say chimerical, right? He actually says chimeras in that original text. It's not too far, I think, a stretch to think that that example was right there in front of Descartes, and he loved it. But what's the point that he's making? The point is also philosophically the exact same point that Cervantes is making, or that he's inserting into the modern world here, that there's a fundamental distinction between my ability to know that something that I'm perceiving in fact accurately represents the world versus my just knowing it in and of itself. And that thing that I know in and of itself, that impression, that raw feel, that qualia that I have that starts to come out and starts to, at that point, infect modern philosophy and do so in a way that we can't even imagine anymore of getting rid of, that comes from somewhere. That idea comes from somewhere. I'm going to call that distinction theatrical, and that's what we're going to get into right now. So Descartes, in another text, actually in a series of letters, says the following. He's going to now turn this idea of that point, that nexus, that border dividing what I can see, feel, touch, and know that it's absolutely is what it is, versus the identity of what that thing is. He's going to turn that into the basis of his theory of consciousness. He writes to Arnaud, we make a distinction between direct and reflective thoughts corresponding to the distinction between direct and reflexive vision. I call the first and simple thoughts of infants direct and not reflective. But when an adult feels sentio, something, and simultaneously perceives that he has not felt it before, i.e. it involves intellectual memory, I call this second perception reflection and attribute it to the intellect alone, in spite of its being so linked to sensation that the two occur together and appear to be indistinguishable from each other. So that feedback loop, that coming back over something, like in our thought experiment from Black Mirror, you're not just in it, but you're slightly removed from it. You're able to reflect on being in it. That's what produces the fundamental difference for Descartes. This appears in all sorts of intellectual traditions, this notion of a reflection, that kind of that minimal distance that's required in order for something like a human experience as opposed to a non-human experience to take place. Classic joke from Freud. Two men meet in a railway carriage at a station in Galicia. Where are you going? The one asks. To Krakow, says the other. What a liar you are, objects the first. If you say you're going to Krakow, you want me to believe you're going to Lemberg. But I know, in fact, you're going to Krakow, so why are you lying to me? Why are you lying to me by telling the truth? Freud's point is that's something specifically human, that we lie by telling the truth, because in the very act of enunciation about ourselves, we're taking into account our expectations. In a theatrical sense, we're always characters acting for those that we're in conversation with. And that acting for has been baked into our subjective lives from early on. Many animals deceive, but it takes symbolization to deceive by telling the truth. Why do I show a chimpanzee here? Because in some ways, higher primates are very close, it's been shown, to garnering the kind of symbolic abilities that might lead them to have that kind of a subjective, what we would call experience, as opposed to seeming to have experience, a self-reflective, a kind of reflexivity of the sort that Descartes talked about. One experiment done by neuroscientists took chimpanzees in cages next to each other and offered them plates of food, large and small. And they set up a sort of devilish device whereby the chimpanzee would press a lever near the large one, obviously, because the chimpanzee wanted the large plate of food. And in so doing, the cage would open not in front of their cage and their large plate of food, but in front of the large food plate in the cage next to them, thus allowing their neighbor access to the large, whereas they were left only with the small. Now, as the experimenters write in their write-up of this experiment, this led to a great deal of howling and a great deal of shaking of cages. But no matter how many times it was repeated, the chimps didn't seem to learn that all they had to do was do the opposite. If they were to press sort of altruistically the button that would allow, that they would think at first glance would allow their neighbor the larger food, they would get the larger food, until the food was removed and a symbol was replaced, a chit. And once they learned to associate large with a certain chit, small with another, instantly they all learned. Now, there's a lot of ways to interpret that, but I'm going to suggest the following. It's, again, a bit of a psychoanalytic interpretation, that the symbol in this particular experiment had the effect of creating a cognitive representation of the other's desire for the chimps in the chimp's brain. The symbol did, in other words, what Lacan said of the signifier in general, that it represents a subject for another signifier. It creates a subjectification loop, that insertion into a creature, an organism, of something like a representation of the other's desire. It represented the chimp, in this case, as a cipher, a signifier for another, and it represented that other as a cipher for the chimp. Raised the question, what does the other want? What do I need to choose such that I get what I want? Ultimately, a question based more on a fundamental one. What does the other want of me? So, as a brief resume, then, of this section before passing into my concluding section, we could say the following. What I know or experience is determined by what I can be deceived about. The location, then, of my essence is a point not of direct experience of the world, of embodied immersion in a full sensorium, but a point of reflection between my own self-presence, my immersion, and my recognition by another who cannot know what I'm thinking and whose thinking I cannot know. And they always go together. they're looped, they're linked together at this sort of point, this nexus between myself and the other. This means that that self that's doing the experiencing rests on a bedrock of otherness, my certainty on a bedrock of deception, or to recall the lesson that we gleaned from Iago, as he's talking about his not wearing his heart on his sleeve, that his essence lies where he can withhold himself. I am, in some ways, precisely that which I am not. Okay, what does this lead to as a kind of final interpretation here? What I'm calling the internal limit approach. Turing didn't answer the question. He avoided the question very willfully. And I think that's meaningful. In fact, I would say that Turing's very avoidance of the question, when he says, I think this question is too meaningless to deserve discussion, I think in some ways that avoidance of the question is the answer to the question that we're asking. What do I mean by that? Thinking, experiencing, something other than simply being immersed in a sensorium, this entails an internal limit that is this irreducible element of what we call experience. Think back to the thought experiment, the Black Mirror thought experience. What is the difference between remembering something absolutely perfectly and actually remembering it really, really, really well? Only one can be remembering. The other is just immersion, right? The same thing with perception. Something has to slip. Something has to be missing. You have to, there's a necessary imperfection, if you will, in our experience of the world that allows it to be reflective as opposed to purely receptive. And that's where Kant comes in, offering a certain answer, a philosophical, profound philosophical answer, both to rationalists like Leibniz, empiricists like Hume, who, according to Kant, were making the same error on both sides of the equation. On the one side, the rationalists, all we have is information. The world really is, and experience, anything we call human experience, is 100% reducible to information. It's just the information has to be complex enough. If the information is complex enough, then the Humes of the world, the Leibnizes of the world, I got that backwards, the Leibnizes of the rationalists, and here I would really put Sam Altman's tweet as kind of a latter-day version of that, are basically saying there's no difference. You are information. Information is you. On the other hand, we have the empiricists like Hume, who really believe that all there is the present, the washing up on our senses of one impression after the other. It was Kant who said neither is right, but both have a portion of the right answer. Kant said that we, rational beings, through our reflective processes, are constantly trying to turn our impressions into information and to map information onto our impressions. And that's precisely what allows us to experience the world as opposed to simply be awash in it in an eternal present. This is what grounds for Kant our humanity. We experience the world reflectively because of the minimal distance entailed by our need to synthesize sensory impressions into concepts. And that same minimal distance accounts for human freedom, hence our ability to choose, hence agency, precisely that we are not so immersed in an ever-flowing present that we wouldn't have something like choice. Thus, his answer to Hume's conundrum, remember when Hume said, gosh, every time I try to explore my experiences, my perceptions of the world, I never find a me that's actually doing the perceiving. All I come up is the actual impression itself. Kant said, no, David, you're completely wrong. And you know why? You wouldn't have any experience of anything if you weren't, in fact, abstracting, if you weren't synthesizing from moment to moment, if there was not a portion of you that was, in fact, slightly in some way independent, lifted, if you will, out of that effluvium of constant perceptions. All right, some final conclusions. AIs make decisions all the time, right? They're making decisions all the time for us. The question is, what kind of decisions are AIs making? If I've offered you a brief, a light Kantian framework for thinking about this, I would suggest that they're not making free decisions, but it is our obligation from a Kantian perspective to be taking our own freedom seriously, reflecting on our obligations and making choices that are not simply the same as following algorithms, right? Kant had a name for making decisions by algorithms, and he had a name for free decisions. He called the former hypothetical imperatives, right? But mandatory, true mandatory imperatives, right? Those categorical ones, those are something that only a truly free creature can make. We can think of the minimal distance then that enables reflective experience and choice as an irreducible internal limit on our immersion in the world. We can imagine, thought experiment-wise, beings that are equivalent to information, right? Like those world-destroying computers, or not just world-destroying ones, the large language models that we get into conversations with. Perhaps we turn to them for therapy or verbal intimacy these days. We can imagine beings that are in fact coterminous with information, but we can also imagine, in fact, we don't have to go very far to imagine them, beings that are nothing but sensate, that swim in a world of senses without that kind of reflection. We can also, and the world has, imagine perfect, all-encompassing beings, something like a monotheistic God that would in some strange way be both, seamlessly combining information and a total experience of the world in every possible way. None of these would be free, and that includes, Kant would tell us, our image of God. God isn't free in that sense. Why? Because to be free, you have to actually not know what the consequences of your actions are, right? You have to be suspended from that. You have to actually be forced to face this being lost in space and time. And God is never lost in space and time. Early modern AI, and I'll conclude with this, may not establish that we're not stochastic parrots, but it does explain why the question that Turing disavowed, the question of whether someone else is thinking or not, how that question itself is inseparable from our being an agent. That's the question behind the word, the question behind the face, the question behind the screen is always going to be there. And we asking that question of others, that is in fact inseparable from our experience as human beings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. Wow. Just wow. We've got some time for questions, concerns, or as is traditional in the NFC complaints.
Oh, and there's a, yeah.
We got a here. Don't make me use the finger.
Thank you so much for the talk. I really learned a lot from that.
Thank
I mean, it's not like more like clarifying question. I would love if you can elaborate more a little bit on the end toward the distinction between the hypothetical and categorical imperatives and how that maps into.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So
Thank
the
you so
questioner
much.
asked me to elaborate a little bit more on the distinction in Kant's ethics between hypothetical and categorical imperatives and how that maps on to this distinction. You're absolutely right. And mea culpa for flying over what is in fact a very complex philosophical point as if it should be completely obvious. Kant did say, look, we operate all the time with should statements, right? And these should statements, not all of them, in fact, very few of them are going to have true ethical resonance. The vast majority of our should statements on any given basis are oriented towards how to get something based on an input, right? If you would like to get the following, you should do this. These are not even in the realm of ethics because it's really just about how general know-how. This is learning. This is how you go about doing things and doing them in perhaps a more efficient or less efficient way. A categorical imperative is an imperative that takes into account your agency as a free being, and it is therefore necessarily universalizable, but it can't, precisely because of that, it can't follow an algorithm. It can't follow a series of instructions, right? It has to be actually you asking yourself the question, is it the case that I can make a universal maxim without contradiction of this of this rule that I want to put into place, of this action? Can I turn it into something? And that is, according to Kant, something that necessarily will lead to you treating others around you who are incorporated within that universalization as something that he calls members of the kingdom of ends, right? So you are not treating them as means. You are not trying to get something out of someone, right? And this is something that requires a different kind. So that's where my argument comes from, right? That this requires being a free agent. It requires being someone who, despite all the embodiment in the world, and we're 100% embodied in the world, at the same point has this, you could call it a strength, you could also call it a weakness, right? This fundamental flaw that we don't, in fact, know ourselves perfectly in the world, that we're always a question to ourselves, and that the question of what others want of us is not something that can be answered in any kind of a fundamental final way. Right? So I'm always asking that question. And by virtue of asking that question, that universalization is always a leap of faith at the same time.
Thank you for the talk. I follow the main argument about how our essence and agency lies in the disconnect, or this small distance.
Yeah, I call it a minimal distance. Yeah, exactly.
And experience. But I wonder if you could clarify and elaborate like what does theatricality, like the term theatricality means in this case? Like, because in that section of the presentation, you talk about Turing test.
That's right.
And Freud's joke.
That's right.
So I wonder why do you choose the word theatricality?
Very good. Excellent question. So I think you all heard that very well. Where does theatricality come into this picture, right? Theatricality, even though it emerges as a way of thinking about space at in my reading of it, and emerges as a cultural force at a particular moment, what that is doing is priming philosophers to think in a certain way about human experience. So the language of theatricality becomes the language with which we think about, from the early modern period in European cultural history, the way we think about our interaction with others. You see what I'm saying? And that then becomes, that's why it takes on the status of such an extraordinarily and indelible problem. My point in going from the theatricality approach to the internal limit approach, and to have Turing at the very front of the theatricality approach, is to show that hundreds of years later, Turing has not stepped out of that mode. He's still thinking in terms of the theatricality approach, as in many ways, as we all are. Yeah.
Early on in your, you started off talking about agency, and there's a word you did not use, which I sort of found myself anticipating, and it never came, and that is consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me that consciousness is in many ways much more important than agency, or at least subsumes agency. I'm not convinced, for instance, that a dog chasing a squirrel doesn't have agency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Who knows? But you know, it's not obvious to me that that's not the case. So I wonder if you could just comment on the notion of consciousness, which the word came up just as you got to Turing, but I don't think you actually used it as though it.
That's exactly
very
right.
important.
Thank you for this excellent question. So this is what I'm working on right now. There's eventually going to be a book called De Anima, and it is going to be an exploration of these, you know, it's a genealogy, if you will, of how we think about human exceptionalism. So consciousness is going to be its own entire section of the book. And the reason I'm not talking about it right now is because in some ways I'm trying to perform the deep history behind what will ultimately become philosophical and scientific and neuroscientific questions around what consciousness is. That's basically the reason why I avoided it now, is I'm trying to use terms that will eventually evolve, so to speak, into that. So the closest here is Descartes' distinction between setio and reflectio. So when you get to reflection, I would say that's the beginnings of something like a science philosophy of consciousness at that point. But it's a big book. Prior to the 20th century thinking, there's going to be a whole section on Hegel, his Bewusstsein and Selbstbewusstsein is going to play a major part in this as well. So thank you for the question. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Bill. You don't remember me probably, but I was a grad student at Hopkins, and I know people who were students of yours and all that.
Oh,
so
wonderful.
It's good to see you.
It's good to see you.
First of all, it's a very ambitious project, and you're covering a lot of ground. So forgive me, I'll be pushing back gently on one aspect, but understanding that this is bigger than that one point. Turing has an important place in your talk here, and the way you presented or summarized sort of Turing's argument, you arrive at the conclusion or that he sort of dismisses the question. And my recollection of the Turing paper is that he doesn't so much arrive at that connection, but he more or less begins with that dismissal.
It's early on in the essay. Yeah.
And really what he does, and the justification for it is that he thinks it's not going to be a productive conversation, like crowdsourcing people, their opinion. And then he reformulates the question in the form of a kind of theatrical, playful dynamic. So, but to me, that there's a slight difference here in the interpretation you provide seems to be like your insight into the text, perhaps more so than how Turing himself.
Yeah.
Like I don't get the sense from him that he arrives at this existential or philosophical view so much as pushing it aside for pragmatic reason, maybe, and then engaging.
I agree.
So if you have any thoughts to.
No, I do. I think that's an excellent corrective. That you're absolutely right. Turing's essay is rather long, and the meat of the essay involves a series of objections that he then plays with and then tries to make arguments against them. And some of those objections are extremely interesting. And so in the longer version, when I actually have time to get into it, I actually do think that there's extremely important thing. I mean, he's a very, very brilliant man. There are very interesting points that he's making as well. But as you say, there's a pragmatic override that takes place in some ways, which is what Turing says you ultimately really, we can think about this a lot, but we can't get around is epistemic privilege. So epistemic privilege is not something that he thinks that we can ever offer evidence for that's going to get us from one side to the other. And the fact that it's a sticking point, right? That it's a big philosophical sticking point, that's what I think justified my taking that one particular sentence of his, which seems so dismissive, even if he himself isn't that immediately dismissive in the essay, because it does create this, for me, analog to that screen, that distinction, that wall that comes up between my experience and the experience of another. What Turing and his later followers will do, not Turing himself so much as his later followers, is use that as this leveling mechanism to say, and therefore, right, you've got nothing on us, right? This is just hubris. And there's a very strong argument there that I want to take very, very seriously. What I don't think is being paid attention to is how the very question itself is endemic and hard to get rid of, and itself indicative of something deeper. I think, and that's what I call in another piece that's coming out soon, the question behind the word, that something about human experience also entails this, what I was getting to towards the end in the eternal limit, this interrogating of another in a deeply existential way, right? So my steps also find their way ultimately into existential philosophy, and as you saw, somewhat psychoanalysis as well, because I can't in a way avoid them. Those questions then emerge, and those approaches and takes emerge out of the very interrogation that I start in the with classical antiquity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to try for maybe a bit of an outlandish point here. But so you really saying that maybe psychoanalysis is really important here because it can help us to understand why we are so interested in studying other people's subjectivity, you know, or other entities' subjectivity, whether they're animate, whether they're thinking, and then to go on to produce AI, right? To try and control it, right? And I guess, yeah, why do people, do you think, say, I can't live in myself and I have to live and think through another, right? It makes me think of like Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah.
You know, that like, I can't be in myself and manage myself. I have to think about others and manage them and control them, and I'll build up my safety. So I'm wondering, yeah, like in your forays into psychoanalysis, like what do you think is going on there that really is at the heart of all of this kind of, yeah, thinking about others and their level of animacy and their amount of movement in the world and trying to control and adjust that?
In some case, thank you very much for the question. In some cases, it is or turns into a question of a will to power, an attempt to control others. There's no question about it. I do think underlying that is more of, and I don't want to call it a passive, but there's an existential kind of dread as well, which is, why am I here? Why can't I answer these questions for myself? Why am I dependent on others? And that's one of, Freud's starting points, is that human beings are beings who are preternaturally dependent on others and need to come to a state of relative independence out of a period of radical dependence on others, and then come up with all sorts of stories, of narratives that explain that in a way. I think your question is terrific because it does ask of me, and this is not the first one that asks this of me, but why is it that I'm so compelled to return to that psychoanalytic question? And it's not one that forces itself upon me in the sense of all of the armature, all the theoretical armature of psychoanalysis that I'm accepting hook, line, and sinker. There's really sort of fundamental issues of what that question. Lacan will sometimes put it in Italian for some reason. Che vuoi? What does the other want of me? What do you want of me? And that this question has an existential valence from psychoanalysis, from the perspective of psychoanalysis, from Freud on. This question of what the other could possibly want from me becomes wrapped in, tied tightly to any sense of ourself. That's what I find attractive about the psychoanalytic paradigm, is not all of everything else that comes along with it, but the fact that it doesn't ever claim that you can get rid of that. It doesn't try to in any way pass that over or say this can be, well, it does say you can find all sorts of ways of pretending that it's not important, right? Of overlooking it, but it's going to stay there. It's a fundamental question.
Follow-up question here, and then we have one online.
Of course.
So, because I'm a theater scholar, so I wonder, where do you locate that emergence of the mode of theatricality as a kind of an epistemological shift? Good. Is it in Diderot or is it in somewhere else?
Before Diderot. And if that is of interest to you, this has been a long planted seed in my own intellectual biography. So I think Bob even referred to it, my very first book, How the World Became a Stage. I actually do a kind of materialist phenomenology of thinking about the self in theatrical terms and where that comes from, how it gets deployed in political theory, how it gets deployed in philosophy. So a lot of, in my current work, as is normally the case, I think it's very common, a lot of these threads of thought that were important at a certain point then come back and they suggest new directions for me. And that was something that I planted for myself as a kind of question 25, 30 years ago, which is now coming to fruition as I think about kind of this, if you will, more fundamental or bigger question.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation today. I just had a quick question about the way that you say that the question of whether someone else is thinking and then being inseparable from our sense of being an agent. Would that be in terms of our being an agent or the sort of computers being an agent?
It could be either. I think it takes place. It's a question that arises in what you would call true intersubjective experiences all the time. But I mean, we can, and not even true intersubjective experiences. neuroscientists have demonstrated a mechanism, a recognition mechanism that arises in human babies at a very early age, where even the vaguest abstract renderings of something like a face cause attention, right? So there's these attention studies. And this makes a lot of sense in terms of evolutionary biology, that the human brain would have evolved in order to quickly catch the attention of other faces and get into some kind of an intersubjective loop with them. The interesting thing here is the fact that it can be triggered by all sorts of non-complex interlocutors, not even interlocutors, something that suggests the possibility of another human. We're very, very quick to at least attempt to communicate with, attempt to find an answer, a truth, or we can have oracles, right? Oracles can be what? We can look for truth in tea leaves, magic 8 balls, right? Talk about a very rudimentary form of a large language model. This would be a small language model. It's got like 8 sides, I think, right? And you shake it, and out of the water, you ask it a question, and something comes up. That's a game that humans have been playing since long before the toy from the 1950s was created. But that toy was so successful because it plugs into something fundamental that we have, which is that desire to ask the question of what the possible intent is on the other side of something. If you see that, and then you realize the complexity, the extraordinary wealth of information that's being pumped into large language models, well, of course we're going to subjectivize them. How could we not?
But then if I assume that because of the fact that other people, other humans are in the same ontological category of being as I am, I assume that they sort of think like I do, but then the computer I can see as obviously manufactured. Right. So an AI, like the other gentleman brought up, how could you, because if we don't even know exactly what consciousness is, right, how can we begin to say, okay, this other computer is conscious? And if I say I don't assume that the computer is thinking because I assume that other people are thinking because I know myself and I know that they are like me, but I know that the computer is nothing necessarily like me, and I know that it's manufactured by people like me. So then I don't necessarily see how if I'm not thinking that it might be thinking, then it kind of detracts from the sense of it being an agent if I don't assume that it could even have that capacity.
I don't disagree with you, but there are an army of AI-aligned philosophers who beg to differ. And the first thing that they'll do is throw the Turing test at you, essentially, and say, well, how do you prove that? How do you prove that there's a fundamental distinction between something that's manufactured and something that's not, right? Leibniz thought so too. I tend to agree with Leibniz about that. And yet, this is an important challenge. And that's why, if you will, I'm trying this discussion in a small way here to open the doors to how long that conversation, that debate had been taking place before Turing asked the question with regard specifically to machine thought.
But then the biology would be natural and the mechanics would be obviously manufactured, right?
It is obvious, but what the arguers in favor of something like an emergent property on the part of a machine would say is precisely because you can't point to the biological mechanism of what experience is. How can you possibly tell me that this highly complex neural network that I've programmed isn't also having an experience like the kind that you're having? Yeah.
Great. So we have a question.
Oh, a question from beyond.
We do have a question from beyond. So this is a question from William Kruger in the Zoom link. So he says, I appreciate the critique of correlation, so between subjects and objects, and I agree with the instinct to emphasize Kant's focus on the subject-object divide as moral and constitutive of freedom. How do we account for the fact that contemporary theory tries to override this subject-object dualism in the interest of moving past the self towards more objective or Marxist concerns, but yet in the realm of AI, there is such an assumed focus on spirit or inner world consciousness, the difference between actions / outer appearances and what is really going on within the person or automaton?
Excellent question. I mostly just agree with the direction of the question. How do we account for that? It seems to be a rising and a contradiction in contemporary cultural directions, at least of cultural theory, that is highly worthy of our attention. I hope in the work that I'm doing, I'm giving it, or at least starting to give it, the kind of attention that it's due.
Bill, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
And really kicking off our year, a lot of style. Great ideas as always. I invite everyone to stay at the reception afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. All right. Crowd here, excellent questions as always. What I would expect, you know, what I would expect. Absolutely.